Hey y'all, what's up? I'm Jess, and this is my garden here at Roots and Refuge Farm. Today is the third weekly garden tour of the gardening season of 2020, and it's a little bit different today. You'll notice I'm wearing a jacket. That's because nature has decided to do a little flashback Friday and bring cool weather back, which I'm not super excited about, but let's go into the garden and talk about it. Another thing that is happening in this garden tour is that I am checking out my garden for damage. Today, we were out, we had some appointments and some errands that had to be handled, and my sister-in-law came over from next door, was watching the kids for us to go out for the first time in the last couple of months that Jeremiah and I have been out of the house together at the same time. And she called us and said there's a party happening in the garden right now. All the male animals are in the garden, as well as a bunch of chickens. And so her and the boys were able to come down and chase them out, but I actually haven't seen the damage yet. I just got home and grabbed the camera and a cup of coffee, and we're gonna go check it out together. Before we start actually looking at the garden, if you're new here, we do garden tours every week through the growing season. They're posted on Saturdays at noon Central Time, and this is just a really thorough look at what we're growing here. We'll do harvesting whenever it comes time for that, and I just like to share kind of what we're doing with what we're growing and how we're growing things. To me, that is a really valuable way to learn, because I'm kind of sharing some hands-on experience. So you learn a lot by growing something, by seeing it growing and understanding how it responds to different situations, and this is my way of just inviting you into my garden to experience that. We are actually not facing freezing temperatures. It looks like it's gonna stay a little bit above freezing, enough so that I don't feel a great need to cover my plants or anything. It's not going to get that cold. I haven't planted out peppers or eggplants yet. They dislike the cold maybe a little more than like tomatoes and some of the other tender things, so those are going back in the greenhouse and getting shut up today. I do have a video about handling like an unexpected freeze if you have plants in the ground, and I'll link that down below. However, it is kind of an interesting thing that there's a little bit of a mess in the garden today. It is minimal from what Maya says, but we did have some damage from the animals getting in here, and unexpected stuff happens when you are gardening. I had a moment whenever my sister-in-law called me and I was like, oh no, but then I really thought about it and I was like, it's early in the season. If there's damage, we can replant and it'll be okay. And I know that it's hard whenever you do face loss, whenever something happens, you have an unexpected freeze that kills your garden, or an animal get in, or pests, or whatever. But the real truth is that there's always next year. That's not a garden cop-out. It's a promise that it is worth continuing to try. We're actually gonna jump right into the raised bed vegetable garden, and we'll take a quick peek over here, but there's not a ton happening over there this week that's new. I did notice though when I came over here that I've got some uprooted carrots that are missing their tops, and so this looks like where probably the animals got to. So that's a little cosmic purple carrot. It's a very small one here, and I can actually salvage these, so I'm just going to set them over here and I'll just take them in, and I don't know what I'll do with that. Maybe put it on a salad. Oh, there's another one right here. A couple more little guys. These were pulled up by my hungry critters, and you can see they kind of got the tops off of some of these other carrots. They weren't interested in the carrots. They were just pulling up the greens, eating the greens. Just one more. No, that's definitely a salad's worth of tiny carrots. One benefit of extended cold weather is that all of these brassicas and cold weather crops, which were, many have already started to bolt, but the ones that haven't, well, they'll have another week or so to develop. So those little carrots will be able to get bigger before they go to seed. Maybe I'll be able to have some more little salads. Not with half of this lettuce though, because half of that got eaten. You can kind of see there. The rest looks really good. I've got lots of peas here doing well. We've been eating these fresh every day. Probably getting to the point that I'm gonna have to take some and maybe put them in the freezer, because they're getting ahead of us and they're gonna start getting too big. Here are the garlic and the onions are all looking really good. These blue potted peas are coming on well. Just a quick look over here. these climbing roses have started to open, and this evening I'll be putting all of these plants back in the greenhouse and shutting it up, possibly turning the heater on. That might be unnecessary, but I just want to make sure that they stay as warm as possible. I basically want to keep all of these peppers from being exposed. My bush beans and the Greenstalk have started to come up. They're looking really great. This tower is Tanya's pink potted beans, and this is the Royal Burgundy bush beans. Someone asked me if you could grow pole beans in those tower Greenstalks. I think you could. It might end up being kind of a tangly mess. Some varieties can get pretty heavy whenever they get really long. So I think vertical supports would be superior, but for pole beans, and I think bush beans would probably do better in the Greenstalk, but you can always try. Beans are such a short season thing. You put a seed in the soil and you can be in the right circumstances. If you've got nice warm weather and they're getting enough sun and water and everything, and your soil's got enough nutrients, you can be picking beans in like 50 days, 55 days a lot of times. And so with the Greenstalk, unless you have just a really short season, you could probably grow beans in that and then grow something else again after you were done picking those. So you could try it. I'd definitely be interested to see if somebody tried it. I'm doing the bush beans this time, but maybe I'll do a trial of something else whenever this one's done. Also, finally did my chalkboard over here. I am totally open to suggestions about what to put on that each week. So if you've got a saying or something that you'd like to see on the chalkboard, make sure you leave a comment down below, and I might just pick yours and you'll be able to see it in a garden tour. All right, so this is obviously just the other side of the pea trellis, and you can see just how loaded these guys are. On the first trellis inside the garden, I've planted noodle beans, a mix of red and green noodle beans. This year when I planted my garden, the thing that I was really focusing on more than years past was production and the tried and true. I really leaned more heavily into tried and true stuff. Going into the year when it was time to really start putting all of everything in, was really the peak of everything happening with COVID. And I'll be completely honest, just going to a grocery store and seeing bare shelves was very sobering to me. And I've been incredibly blessed in my life to grow up in an area where I'd actually never seen that before, and I am thankful for that even more so. I don't take that for granted. It really did kind of shift me into a gear of being maybe somewhat more prepared this year. I'm still growing some fun stuff, still growing some beautiful stuff, growing some flowers that just bring me joy, and varieties that I just think are interesting. Like for instance, I did 2 different trellises with noodle beans because I knew they would produce a lot fast, and my mindset was that I would know that I would have food fast for my household, and I would also have food to share with other people. And these produce so much. They just really crank out beans, and noodle beans are 12 to 18 inches long, so they produce a lot of beans, and each one is the equivalent of 3 or 4 other snap beans. And so the other thing is that I really didn't, I went to the tried and true. I was going for production. I was being very aware of what I was choosing and was not being frivolous at all in what I was choosing. But I am very motivated by a beautiful garden. Just completely honest, I want it to be something that I stay interested and passionate about, because it's a lot of work, and I think that that makes the work easier. It makes it not work. It makes it something that you enjoy. I put these noodle beans right here in the entry trellis. I like for this one to be very inviting. And just wait, here in another 5 weeks or so, you'll be able to check a garden tour out and see those things as they start to produce, and they are stunning. They're long beans. They're sometimes called, or asparagus beans, and they're more traditionally used in Asian cooking. So they're more for like stir fries rather than being boiled. And if you can them, I like to pickle them. They're really good for that. But stir fries is in some like sesame oil or something like that, a quick blanch and then a stir fry is where they really shine. I've got some lovely lettuce here. These are all beets. You'll see a little bit of traces of diatomaceous earth. As I dusted them, they were starting to get a little insect damage, and a lot of them are really close to harvesting, but it rained heavily last night, so it's mostly washed off. Here I've got chamomile looking lovely. These little squirts here are Texas Hill Country okra, and I've got this planted all along down to the next trellis there. I've got okras planted about every 2 feet here. Also have nasturtiums all over, multiple different varieties here. This must be the King Theodore, because I can see that's a really dark red bloom that's coming up. And here, let's see, variegated peach bloom. I think this must be the Alaskan peach salmon, I think is what it's called. More nasturtiums down here on the end of this bed. We'll see how well these fill out being so close together. I was just kind of curiously trying that out. This was a really lovely sunflower. It is no more. It succumbed to the party in the garden today. And this is the signs of my sweet 5-year-old Benjamin, who comes down and picks himself some snacks. I guess he didn't finish that one. Nasturtiums are fantastic companion plants. And the way that I like to do companion planting is more along the line of just really diversely planting the garden and spreading out different plants that just make for a good, healthy, diverse ecosystem overall. Nasturtiums are so beneficial because they're edible. You can eat the leaves and the flowers of nasturtium. They're a little spicy. The flowers, I would say, maybe have a little sweetness to them with a kick. The spiciness of it reminds me a little bit of horseradish. So if you like that, they're fantastic on things like tacos or in slaws. They're beautiful on salads. And you can just treat them like any other salad green. And so it's a really great benefit because you're still growing food. You're not giving up space in your food garden for something that's not edible. They are also a really effective trap crop, so they'll attract bugs to them instead of other things. And you know, the thing with any sort of flowering plant like that is going to attract pollinators, and it's just going to add to the overall benefit of your garden for beneficial insects. And there will be different things that you read that make claims like this does this and repels this and all that, and I don't know, that's so hard for me to say for sure because you can find so much contradicting information. But on something like a nasturtium, I just feel like you can't go wrong with it because you can, I mean, if it does nothing else, you can eat it and it's pretty. This year I did experiment a little bit with Charles Dowding's method of multi-sowing. So he starts like multiple root vegetables like beets in cells beforehand and then moves them out into the garden. And I've started to dig away from the roots of some of these things, and some of them are not getting a ton of root yet, but some of them have pretty decent roots. These beets, I think most of these are early wonder beets. Like you can see here, well, I don't know if you actually can see, but that root's probably about this far apart. It's getting pretty big, and it's got another small one over on the other side of it. I wasn't sure how well multi-sowing was gonna do for me in the spring because we do so often have springs that get very warm very fast, and sometimes brassicas just don't work very well, and root vegetables just don't work very well. But this has been a cooler spring and it seems to be doing okay. I don't know that I'll do it that way again. I think I might just, because of my climate, I might just direct sow my beets. But I will say that I don't know that I've ever had them this big and lush by this time before, and so I might end up with better flavor considering they grew the majority of their life in colder weather. Over here I have some Coeur d'Aubus's cabbages, which are like oxheart cabbages. You can see here's the insect damage that I was talking about that made me dust these. Now that the diatomaceous earth has worn off, I may come after these with a little bit of BT spray, probably tomorrow evening because I think it's supposed to rain again a little bit tonight. And anytime that you apply an organic pesticide like BT or diatomaceous earth or neem, once it rains you need to apply it again. So I'm just gonna wait, and probably need to go ahead and get these as well. You can see they're getting a little bit lacy. And that is pretty par for the course on brassicas this time of year. But some of these cabbages are starting to get to be a really good size, so I want to be aggressive on treating these pests, because after this next cool week, I think some of these are probably going to be pretty close to being harvestable. I have multiple different cabbages here, and many of them are starting to head up. You can see here's more looking really beautiful. I think some of these are Savoy cabbages, some of these are more Coeur d'Abuts. This is one that's called Valencia. I'll look that up and put it down on the screen because I can't remember the name. I've never successfully grown cabbage in the spring before. I try every year. A lot of times they bolt before I get to grow them. They do okay in the fall here, and it's more a fall crop, but usually it's just a matter of me being dead ready to get in the garden by the end of December, and so I just start cabbage seeds and just try. And if the circumstances aren't agreeable, then I don't get cabbage. But I think this year I'm going to. I've got a few more kohlrabis here. A couple of these were multi-sown. A couple of them have just slight bug damage on them. Not too bad, but they're all about ready to be harvested. And the remainders of my rutabagas, or cabbage turnips, or Swedes, as I've learned that they're called in some places. We've been eating these and they're so delicious. This week I harvested 4 big rutabagas and took them in, peeled them, diced them up into like chunks, and boiled them until they were soft, like you would boil potatoes. Mash them and put just maybe like a tablespoon or 2 of butter. It wasn't a lot of butter, but then sour cream and chives from right here, which I diced up really small, and salt and pepper. And the sour cream and chive rutabagas mash were so good. Just really, really fantastic. I don't know exactly how to describe it. Sort of turnipy, but maybe less earthy. Changed my garden plan for this year. I'm definitely going to grow more of those. That's the Navone yellow rutabaga from Baker Creek, and I will be growing quite a few of those, hopefully in our high tunnel over the winter, because that is just a fantastic addition to winter meals. They can also be roasted, put in soups. They're really, really good. You can eat the greens. Man, I really, really liked those. I kind of miss some of the small stuff here, and it's all going to become very apparent soon, but here we have some little bitty things. These are actually Kajari melons on this trellis. Right over here are Armenian white cucumbers on this trellis. I've got like a little basil here, a little purple basil, and these areas where you see like a kind of bald spot in the mulch, that's because I've pushed the mulch aside and put seeds in. And in an area like that between 2 trellises, that's going to be something like a flower. I'll have to wait till it comes up to know what's there, because I don't remember. Here is a zinnia. These are some melons called Delice de la Table melons, which are from M.I. Gardner. You see they're coming up here for this trellis. It's just like a small melon. My banana trees here are starting to come up. Banana plants are technically not trees. And I have some different basils in here. Some sweet basil, some Thai basil. The rest of that is just weeds. And I'm not even going to bother pulling those until I've got the mulch out here to put down, or else they will just come right back. But I'm going to have to thin out the banana trees first, because I don't want more than 3 in this bed. If they get too dense in here, I'm afraid they'll tear the bed apart. So I'm going to have to thin those out and just let the 3 big ones stay. Those banana plants, I don't know the variety. I was given them by a friend of my mom's, and they've just shared them over the years with lots of different people, and they multiply so fast. But they don't produce fruit here. I am going to put one of them in my high tunnel in one of the beds, just to see what happens. I'm not planning on heating the high tunnel, so I think that it will probably get too cold in there to keep it alive over the winter. but we'll see. They are really beautiful though. Their leaves are good for cooking, and they're just so fun to watch grow. Those, by the end of last year, they were probably over 9 feet tall. They were just really big. Their leaves were massive. They were so gorgeous back there in the garden. I harvested a bunch of the leaves to use like on the grill to wrap food in to grill it. What I have to do is just kind of top dress that with some compost and then mulch it, and they'll be good to go for the summer. They're very hands off. This bed I haven't done much with. That's the other trellis that has noodle beans on it. And here I have a couple of clematises that I planted. They haven't really taken off yet. I've got some sunflowers in the corners of these beds. There's chamomile right here, the Zloty Land chamomile from Baker Creek. It actually looks like it took a little bit of a beating today. Based on the look of the other bed over there, I've got some beans, dragon tongue bush beans, and they're pretty jostled. They look like maybe the chickens got in there with them. It should be okay. They might be a little bit broken, but they'll probably bounce back. Same thing with this chamomile. I'm getting a lot of questions about chamomile. I do grow the chamomile all throughout the garden, and I do harvest it for tea. When it starts to blossom, it puts off lots and lots of flowers, and I'll come out every morning and I'll pick those as well as calendula flowers, and I just leave like a tea towel on the counter on top of the dehydrator. I don't put those in the dehydrator. I just let them air dry. It only takes a couple of days for them to be completely dry by putting them face down on a tea towel in the kitchen. After a couple of days, once they're completely dry, I'll put them in a jar. And then, like with the dried flowers, you can just steep your tea. You can infuse those into oil. Chamomile and calendula are both fantastic for skincare, and so oil that's been infused with calendula, I'll use that for moisturizing, or if you make any sort of like soaps or salves, using that in place of whatever oil is called for is really beneficial. I've had a few people ask me like what the trick to germination is with chamomile. And the thing that I found, I've direct sown it successfully, and I've started it underneath a grow light successfully. With that is the seeds are so tiny that you really don't need to put them under the soil. Just lightly sprinkle them on top of the soil and press them in. Another thing I've found with chamomile is that it doesn't mind being a little crowded. So starting several seeds in one pot is fine. If they're close together, you don't have to thin those out. I think that they maybe like being crowded, which would make sense because there's no way that seeds that tiny, where so many seeds are produced together, are being naturally sown with space. Like they're being sown in nature close together. So it would make sense that we would want to mimic that. And also they're not being sown really deep in nature with seeds that light. They're likely being sown on the wind and scattered across the surface of soil. We just need to mimic that. Surface sowing, and what I've done sowing them inside is set those pots in like a bottom water tray, so they're actually being watered from pulling their moisture. That soil is pulling the moisture from the bottom, and that way you're not having to water from the top and misplace them. So if you do have to water from the top, I would definitely use a spray bottle. The long row of leeks over here is looking very good. There's several things here that have already been harvested. Wind song. There are seeds sown in here. I've got a big sunflower as well as some zinnias. This corner of this bed has been zinnias for as long as I've had this bed. Zinnias are fierce reseeders. So if you leave them in your garden, and you don't cut every single flower off of them, you allow them to dry out and go to seed, you're gonna have zinnias back in your garden, wherever they end up. They'll fly somewhere else, but usually wherever you had them last year, they will come back there. And so I had some zinnia seeds. I don't know where they came from. I probably got them in a seed swap the first year that we had this garden. And I don't know if something cross-pollinated or what happened, but there is a color of flower that comes up here in this bed every year, and it reminds me of like an ombre sherbet. Like, it is so pretty. And I don't save my zinnia seeds because all my zinnias have a blight that just, it can be passed through the seeds. So I don't save the seeds because I don't want to end up giving them to somebody else and putting that in someone else's garden. And any zinnias that I plant in this garden end up with that blight because it's here, it's in the garden. It's like a black and white spots that end up all over the zinnias by the end of the year. And it's not that big of a deal, but it is here and I wouldn't want to pass it to anybody. There is a zinnia that reseeds, and so I just always plant zinnias in that corner, and then if anything volunteers, I let it grow because I always hope that sherbet zinnia comes back. And it every year it ends up coming back somewhere in the garden. It's just like a little surprise for me. Usually it's right there, so hopefully it'll join us this year. Like here you can see, here's the zinnias that I planted, and then there's one I did not plant that there, unless it's a seed that washed down there, which is possible. I probably did not plant that one right up against the wall either. Those probably came up on their own. So we'll see if I get any sherbet zinnias. These are cuckoozy gourds. Here is a nasturtium, which is doing amazing. Not 100% sure what this variety is. I'll have to look. But that's super healthy. Here I've got my first cucumbers of the year, setting flowers and little tiny fruits. Good job. And here in this bed, I planted Silver Queen okra. That's what these little ones are. I'll have sunflower here, the cuckoozy squash, which comes down, the cucumbers with nasturtiums, sunflower down on that end, and then okras here, which will get really big and tall and fill out. I don't know the nature of the cuckoozy. It's technically a gourd, but I've never grown it before. Gourds typically handle heat okay, so I think it'll be okay. Cucumbers usually tap out here by like mid to late June, because when it gets really hot, they just start tasting bad. They start tasting really bitter. They're hard to give enough water when it's so hot because they're gonna end up drooping by the end of the day. And so sometimes we're tearing the cucumbers out by like midsummer. And so usually if I have an arch with cucumbers, I'll try to plant something next to it that's getting really big by midsummer. So when I'm tearing those cucumbers out and replanting that arch, it's not a super bare spot. Well, this is the first row of tomatoes. They are looking good. Oh no, I did lose some tomatoes. Sad day. It looks like almost all of the tomato plants were unscathed. However, right here in these two spots were two small berries crazy cherry plants that had been really puny, and I'd moved out here and I noticed yesterday that they were looking really good and they had new growth, but they are gone. I can't even see, like, I can't even find the roots. This kale's been a little munched on also. Well, could have been worse. let me find the optimist inside of my heart. Whenever she called me and told me that all the boy goats were in the garden, I was like, oh man. And I was thinking, well, at least I just planted all those tomatoes in the high tunnel, because I was thinking I might not have any tomato plants when I get home. Like, goats can do some damage. And she came out here and chased them out, and Thorin Oakenshield, the big Nubian, was laying in one of the garden beds, and the others were going around. The small amount of damage is very good. The garden just won't be the same without Barry and his crazy cherry. Maybe I've got some seeds. Maybe I can direct sow some. Because these are gone. R.I.P. Barry. I just don't understand why this puny, tiny little shrimp of these plants, they were looking so much better, but they were still very small. Like, that's there, this is here. You go for that. I don't understand. I'm glad that these are still here. I'm glad they're okay. All these cherry tomatoes are here. They're looking good. Check this out. I'm getting really close to the trellis with this yellow pear. It's early in the season, it's okay. All right, I'm gonna answer a couple questions about tomatoes. What do I tie them to the trellis with? That's something that's come up a lot. I've used a lot of different things, so let me tell you. They make clips that you can just clip them on and take them off and reuse them at the end of the year. Those are really cool. I have a lot of tomato plants, and so I have never used those. I've had a handful of them, but I've never used those for all my plants, just because to buy enough for, you know, hundreds of plants was just never something that I was able to do. I have done pantyhose also for a lot of plants, unless you just have the hookup with like a ton of pantyhose. For me, going to the store and buying the pantyhose was also not super cheap for a one season solution. I have taken old t-shirts and cut them up into strips, and that was pretty good. And I would say that is probably, if you're looking for like an eco-friendly and cheap solution, I would say cutting up old t-shirts is a pretty good solution. They do stretch out and they get kind of rotty throughout the season, and sometimes they end up like breaking by the end of the season. So that's something to consider, but you probably have some old t-shirts, so they're free and they're easily replaceable. You can just cut up another shirt if you need to replace them. The product that I like the most, and I do use some plastic products, and this is one of the ones that I'll use, is this plastic tie tape that you just stretch and break off. And one big roll lasts me all my plants through the season. I like it because it stretches. I don't know how easy that's gonna be to get. If I can find it on Amazon, I'll link it below. But you know, ordering things is a little bit harder right now, so I might end up using t-shirts again this year. I probably still have some of that tie tape, so I might end up using what I have left of that. But that's how I tie my plants to the trellis for the year. I don't like using anything that's going to be really tight and restrictive, because usually when you're first tying them, those stalks are going to get a lot bigger. Another thing that I want to share with you guys, and I talked about this in a vlog recently about pruning suckers. So this is what I do. I pull these suckers, which are the little growths out of the armpits of the tomato plants. I pull these off because the way that I prune my tomatoes down to one main stalk. These are suckers down here. Now, if you end up with a sucker that's big, they'll get big fast. I mean, this thing will be like a branch before too long. This is what makes your plant really bushy, is letting those go. What you can do once they get big, probably a little bigger than this, is you can pull these off. You could just stick it in the soil just like this, and it may grow roots that way, especially if it's bigger. Or you can go stick it in a cup of water and it will grow roots, and you can plant that in the ground and have another tomato plant. In fact, now that the season's really starting in some areas, now some areas you're probably just now getting plants like this for sale at the stores, or not even yet. But some areas, my area, we've had tomato plants for sale at the store for over a month. And some of those plants now are getting kind of big that haven't been purchased. You can go buy one plant at the store, prune off those big suckers and put them in water, root them, and you can get like 5 plants for the price of one by propagating all those suckers. It's a good way to you know, grow the amount of plants you have on a budget. All right, the damage abounds. So here's my artichoke. Poor Artie. Come on back, man. You can do it. He bless you to live. Look, his little leaves. That's all he's got left. He's a fighter, though. He's been through 2 winters now, and he's pulled through. That sunflower, that's not going to live. That's okay, though. I'll replant it. Sunflowers grow fast. And here, the beans. These definitely got scratched through by the chickens. But these will be okay, even though they took a beating. All this, that's all chicken damage. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't the chickens that pulled those little tomato plants up, because they probably couldn't get these up. Over here, I've got my cucamelons, which I transplanted out. They seem to be doing okay. I've direct sown some Parisian pickling cucumbers here on this TP trellis. Haven't addressed this bed yet. I've got some beets still growing down there, which I've fertilized, and they seem to be growing better now that I've emptied it out. But this bed, we're just gonna put more compost down, and I'll probably plant peppers here when it gets warmer. I had seedlings for red Malabar spinach on here. Okay, they're still here. They made it through the Godzilla attack. There's another one right there. Those will take off when it gets warmer. They just take a little while when it's cool. these trellises weren't planted yet, so there really wasn't much here to destroy. Now these beds have clearly been scratched through, but there wasn't really anything for them to mess up. I have some Ancash Market Cukes back here. I've got this one, that one's gone, and here's one, and that one's gone. So I'll just replant the sides that are missing. That's not a big deal. That's where Thorn Oak and Shield was laying in the bed. Plum goofy, but could be worse. This could have been a lot worse, seriously. All my tomatoes, they're still here. Maybe just a little bit, you know, moved around. So here, I'm gonna show you is something that happens sometimes. Right here has basically this plant split. It got a sucker. I can't really tell which one of these is the sucker and which one is like the new growth of the tomato plant. And if I had to guess, I would guess that this is the sucker right here, but it's hard to tell. And so when this happens, sometimes if I miss one and it gets away from me, I just leave them and I'll let this plant have 2 main stalks instead of 1. I'm gonna try to be really aggressive in pruning in my greenhouse so that I don't have this happen, because I planted my plants a lot closer together. But out here, I typically just try to prune to 1 main stalk or 2. And if it happens to be 2, that's not that big of a deal. I get asked a lot about pruning cherry tomatoes. And what I usually do is I prune them to 1 main stalk until they get a few feet tall. And then I start letting them branch off a little bit. But if you live in an area where it is super humid, you might want to consider pruning them more. That really just, if they start looking like they're struggling, if I start seeing spots come up, I'll just take out some of the branches pretty much and just prune them back. Now I have started planting some seeds down these areas. I'm really glad I hadn't moved out everything that I was going to move out, because I might have had more damage if these beds had been as full as they're going to be here in a couple of weeks. But I'm going to be putting a lot of ground cherries down this row. I sowed some roselle seeds down in between these beds and they hadn't germinated yet, so I'm sure they're still fine. So here are the tomatoes back in the high tunnel. I went ahead and put these guys in, and I think that they'll be okay with the cool weather that's coming through, because it's not going to get super cold. It's not going to drop below 40 degrees here, and that's also just for a brief while. It's still staying really warm during the day. The pigs were screaming for Maya to come feed them. So back here I've got lots and lots of tomatoes. I have already planted like 130 tomatoes actually, and I've still got about 50 left to go. And I've got them laid out and I'll show you exactly what's where. But it kind of shocked me when I realized that I'm going to be growing more tomato plants in this high tunnel than I grew all in the front garden last year. So for those of you who have been with me for a little while and saw how many tomato plants we actually grew out front last year, this is more than all of those. And we're still growing 3 rows in the big garden. So lots and lots of tomatoes this year. I've kept in mind the varieties that I'm growing for the purposes of canning, eating fresh, being able to quickly freeze to process later, and for sharing with people. The tomatoes in this high tunnel are planted about 12 to 14 inches apart. I kind of just eyeballed it, I didn't measure it. And these will be very carefully pruned down to 1 stem. We are not doing a lower and lean method or any traditional high tunnel methods this year. We are doing cattle panels in this greenhouse, and the reason for that is that I like to do things where I just change 1 factor at a time. I don't want to change everything at one time, because then if I fail or if I don't like it, I won't know why. And so I'm basically moving my outside operation into a high tunnel this year, doing things very similar. I am interested in learning about lower and lean and tomahawks and, you know, all the ways of stringing tomatoes up to the roof. I'm very interested in learning about that. And I think that once I get a good grip for growing in this environment this year, I can be a little more prepared. We decided to do this kind of later on in the season, and I just did not feel comfortable trying to learn something new and implement something new this late in the season. It was too much for me. Now we'll see if these plants get really tall. I might end up having to tie them off to the ceiling anyway, but I'm prepared for that. I have to be realistic about what I'm able to learn and do in excellence, and I did not feel comfortable trying to do a whole new way this late in the game. So this bed is my hybrid bed. Most of these are Jet Stars. This whole row here is Jet Star, and about half of that row is Jet Star, and the other half is a hybrid called Better Boy. I bought these started locally at a place that buys their starts from a local nursery. Back here, there are a few different varieties. This row, almost all the way to the end, is Dr. Witchy's Yellow, one of my most favorite tomatoes. And the last 5 or 6 plants down on this row are ones called Thornburn's Terracotta, which I really enjoyed last year. Had a great flavor and a really dark orange rich terracotta flesh. Right here, I've got Amish Paste for the first little part of this row, several plants of that. Aunt Ruby's German Green, about 6 of those. Bonnie Best. I only have a few of these. Let's see, 4. These were recommended by my friend Jen Stivers over at Stivers Homestead. Here we've got the Alpaca. That one was recommended by Luke from M.I. Gardener. And then I've got a few spaces down on the end. I got to figure out what 5 plants I'm going to put there. Everything in this greenhouse is either my tried and true or plants which came heavily recommended by trusted sources. I've got the Alpaca, the Bonnie Best, the Jet Star. That's what Living Traditions has a lot of success growing. So planting in this greenhouse, I really wanted to get the most out of it. I wanted this to be what was producing to put food in the pantry. So I really stuck with planting a lot of what I know I like. And right now I'm trying to debate on whether I want to do another row of climbing triple crops or if I want to vary this row. Right now I'm definitely leaning towards keeping it the same. I even thought it would be really cool because I'd mentioned in a vlog how I'd like to keep a scale and a notebook down here in this greenhouse and record the production of the hybrid bed. Climbing triple crop is an heirloom that was developed, I believe it was in the 50s, and it was actually developed as a production tomato, but it was developed as a production tomato before food was shipped quite as much as it is now. And so it has a really good, rich heirloom flavor and the ability to grow really big, tasty, rich tomatoes with that traditional tomato flavor, but they grow a lot. They do really well being pruned down to a single stalk, and they can grow really tall. The only thing is they struggle with humidity. I've always had problems with climbing triple crops getting sick in my very wet garden with all our rain. So my hope is that they'll do awesome in the high tunnel because that's what they were bred for all those years ago. And my thought was it would be really cool to plant this bed all with climbing triple crops and record the production of these 2 beds and see if there's a difference between the hybrids, which are made for production, and the heirlooms, which were made for production, and just see. Back here, I paused and have some decisions to make as well. So this whole row here, to about right there, these are all Blue Beauties from Wildboar Farms, and here I've got 12 plants of Black Beauties from Wildboar Farms. You can see that really dark foliage. And then down on the rest of this row, these are all Abe Lincolns. And I also have a handful here of Arkansas Travelers that I'm planning on putting back here. After I committed all of this bed space to what I was gonna plant, I started thinking about other things I would like to grow and started thinking about possibly growing more tomatoes out here, but I'm really talking myself down because, you know, I like to read and hang out with my husband and, you know, do things other than can. And I think if I planted that 60-foot bed with 50 more tomato plants, I would be just writing off any hope of doing anything else this summer. I'm already gonna have a lot of preserving to do. So this in-ground bed, the sunflower garden, most of the things that are planted here have really started to come up and they're looking really good. I need to get this mulched. That's been on the to-do list all week and hasn't gotten done. Maybe by the next garden tour this will be mulched. You can just take a quick look here I would say that the buttercup squash is probably growing the fastest here. Those are New England sugar pie pumpkins right back there. These are sweet meat squash, and here are butternut squash. And back here the sunflowers are just really taking off, looking really beautiful. I've already thinned these out a little bit, but they could probably use a little bit more thinning. It's so hard to do when they're so healthy and pretty. And you want to know what? I thinned the sunflowers at the front, and now the ones that are left got eaten by goats. I guess if I hadn't thinned them, they probably would have both gotten eaten by goats. The sweet potatoes are coming in strong. I am thinking that I'm gonna lay a light layer of mulch down here, because if not, I'm gonna end up doing a lot of weeding before these sweet potatoes really take this over well. I've got amaranth coming up everywhere because I grew it last year and it reseeded itself all over my farm. You can see here, these are spaghetti squash, and they're starting to really trail. Now, if you'll see here, you can kind of see the area where we drive back here. Maya has hopes and dreams of putting a shop in back in this corner, and he's hoping to lay the foundation for that here in a couple of months. So he needs to be able to drive back here. And what I'm thinking I'm gonna do is right here where you can see the grass growing, this is where we're gonna run the electric fence around here. And I'm going to go ahead and cardboard down and mulch everywhere you see grass between these gardens and in this little apron for these squash to be able to ramble this way. But these bush variety summer squash are starting to really put a lot of fruit on. Here's some zucchini squash here. You can see those green fruits growing. And these are the ones that I just direct sowed right here. So you can see how fast they're growing. I finished planting all the okra here. That's a lot of okra. We're gonna have so much okra this year. And then down here, these are actually all melons, and some of these I direct sowed, and they're just taking their time coming up. The potatoes are beautiful, huge, and starting to flower, which is kind of just part of the process. You see here, here's thing 1 and thing 2, thinking that I'm talking to them. And check this out, I've got some tomatillos volunteering back here. The first year that I did garden tours, the 2018 season, I think I started them in June, because in my mind at the time I was like, well, before then there really isn't just very much to show. But looking back, I remember looking back at those tours from the beginning of June and being like, wow, the garden was so small, it was so young, it was so bare. And then it just exploded over the course of the next 8 weeks and was just so fruitful, and I'm pulling in just baskets and baskets and baskets of produce. And the next year, I remember thinking, I really need to cover this early stage, you know, the May stage of the garden. For me, it's May and April is when all the legwork goes into that harvest coming. All of the beginning of, oh, well, you can't see anything here, but I've just put seeds in the ground. Or, oh, look, these little sprouts are just coming up. And it's interesting because I think it's an incredible learning thing for new gardeners that this is a very important season. I mean, what I decide to invest now is directly connected to what I will harvest 3 months from now. If I don't plant it now, I won't get it then. And it is a lesson in patience. It is a lesson in hard work. And I love to be able to share that with you guys because it's encouraging. Now, I look at something like this sweet potato bed, and all I see here is so much promise. But to a person who's not a gardener, this looks like, well, just a lot of dirt. And I guess my thought is, if I can share the process with you guys, it can be encouraging for you. If you haven't made it through the process enough times of hard work and investment equals reaping reward, you know, reaping and sowing, it takes a while to really get it. And now, you know, it's easy to get really carried away in the planting stage if you don't realize what's coming on the other end of that. It's easy to not plant enough if you don't realize what's coming on the other end of that. It's easy to give up too early if you don't realize, you know, the process. And so I want to share the process with you guys because I think it will make you better gardeners. I think it makes me a better gardener. I think that sharing and pulling you guys into my excitement excitement on this makes me a better gardener. So thank you for hanging out with me today. I'm glad that there wasn't more damage in the garden. I really am. And I feel so much anticipation. I hope that you guys can feel it. Thank you so much. I bless you. Until next time.